Hello, I'm Dr. Roy Barsness, author of the text Core Competencies in Relational Psychoanalysis, a guide to practice, study, and research, and founder and executive director of the new Contemporary Psychodynamic Institute, who is the sponsor of these interviews. In the first episode of these series, I spoke of the research behind the compilation of the text that resulted in the discovery of 7 core competencies reflective in the practice of relational psychoanalysis. These competencies are actually what I prefer to call disciplines, are number 1, therapeutic intent, number 2, therapeutic stance, number 3, deep listening, affective attunement, 4, the there and then and here and now, number 5, patterning and linking, number 6, repetition and working through, and number 7, courageous speech, discipline, spontaneity. A separate and overarching theme was the core category of love. I then recruited various relational psychoanalytic writers to write about each of these disciplines, and now am interviewing each of them for this series. So welcome to today's episode, featuring psychoanalyst and author Dr. Stuart Pizer, who contributed to the third discipline, deep listening, affective attunement. Dr. Pizer received his undergraduate and doctoral education in clinical psychology at Harvard University. He's been a psychotherapist for over 50 years and a psychoanalyst for over 30. He is currently an assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School, a faculty supervising personal analyst and founding board member and past president of the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis. And he's a visiting faculty and member of the advisory board at the Toronto Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. He's also been a past president of ABPP. He is the author of the book, Building Bridges, The Negotiation of Paradox in Psychoanalysis, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Beyond his credentials, the following words capture Dr. Pizer's spirit and character in his work. Here's what he says. Although I've been a psychotherapist and an analyst for a long time, each new treatment process feels fresh, alive, and challenging in novel ways. He says, I feel fortunate and grateful that I spend my day deeply and intimately immersed in human connection and the uncertain but creative process of fostering over time the emergence of a person's openness to experience, freedom from deadening defensive repetitions, release from psychic pain, and joy in bringing their self into focus. Because this process requires ongoing negotiation by analyst and patient, he says, I find myself continuously challenged on the edge of my personal limitations, along with my own growing edge of freedom, relaxation, and play. Hence, in an analytic partnership, we both grow. Those are really lovely words, Stuart, that you've used to
Thank you.
To describe this work. It's so vivid and vital, and I appreciate being able to actually read this to our audience. So thank you for joining us today. Before we get into our interview, I want to give the context to our listeners about this particular chapter in the book. Listening is the sine qua non of most therapeutic approaches, but what distinguishes the listening skills of the relational analyst is what Wright called listening with the third ear, Singer called the viscera, and Ogden reverie. My own understanding of listening is a listening to the conversation that is at hand. That is, that listening which attends to affects, the body, the dissonances, the clumsiness that I might be involved in, those things that are beyond the content of the words that are seeking voice. The analyst seeks to be highly attuned and self-reflective, paying a great deal of attention to what is happening within their own mind and their own affective state, recognizing that which is being stirred within their own affective state is in part a transmission of the patient's internal and external world. Attending to affect, one is better able to enter into the unconscious and dissociated aspects of the patient. Dr. Pizer refers to this deep listening as generous involvement. I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful 2 words, generous involvement. And in this chapter, speaks to how affective involvement is central to our work. In my research, or in the writing of the book, the structure is the core competencies. So we have deep listening, affective attunement. I do an introduction, and then I have included what I call properties, which are actually direct quotes out of the interviews that I did with the analysts who participated in the program. I want to just share those with you here, and so that you can see, again, the context for which our conversation will be today. In this, you see that some of the direct quotes are, I pay deep attention to affect states. I look within myself. I attend to the effect of my impact or the effect of my own personality on the therapeutic encounter. I attend to countertransference experiences as a means for understanding the patient. The relational analyst follows affective experiences, asking, what is this patient triggering in me? Who, how, what, why? Where's the emotion? What is the patient trying to protect or avoid, or what am I? Intuition is highly valued with the relational analyst as they attend to inklings or having a sense of something, encouraging their own minds to free associate, wondering what their thoughts and affects have to do with the patient. Where is this happening in my body? What is happening in the us? And that we cannot ignore the two strongest affective states, love and hate. Dr. Pizer, you begin this chapter with a subtitle, The Analyst's Generous Involvement, Recognition and the Tension of Tenderness. These two key vivid phrases, generous involvement and tension of tenderness, shape the remainder of this chapter. Elaborate for our listeners on what you mean by these two statements.
Sure. First, I want to say that I think that in creating your curriculum and the book, you located and delineated really wonderfully useful categories.
Thank you.
And while I am representing deep listening and affective attunement, in a sense, I think of generous involvement as my stance. So there is a kind of overlap. There's a unity to who we are and what we do. And we have to segment them to teach and to focus in. So what do I mean by generous involvement? I mean being present, being connected, offering our mind and our heart fully as a receptive space, not a vacuum, because it's a responsive space with our patient. I don't want to think of generous as like a virtue, cultivated virtue. I think it is intrinsic to the attachment system and in a sense to survival. Darwin, who is thought of as, the voice of conflict and the struggle to compete and survive, just as much emphasized pro-social aspects of the survival of the species. A couple of years after I wrote my book, I read in the New Yorker about ant colonies, where the male ants go out to forage for nourishment in the day. They return to the ant colony. Some of them have found good nourishment. Some of them have not found so much. Those who are well fed literally regurgitate some of their food into the mouths of the underfed ones.
Wow, what a metaphor.
I mean, it is such a primitive statement of the evolutionary function of giving and receiving. And in that sense, I think that we're endowed with an attachment system for survival.
Oh, that's really beautiful. What do you mean by tension of tenderness?
I mean, one of the first psychoanalytic authors I read was Harris Dax Sullivan.
Yeah.
I my conversion experience at Harvard as an English major was take an experiential group, full year course with readings. So I read Melanie Klein and Bion's Experiences in Groups and Freud's Interpretation of Dreams and Harry Stack Sullivan as a college sophomore. Harry Stack Sullivan had his own, perhaps even intentionally idiosyncratic way of wording things. He certainly wanted to make it clear that he was not talking about the classical analytic terms, but something else. I'm thinking of the basic attachment, caregiving, care receiving system, which I guess is why I began by talking about the Anne column. Sullivan believed that at the earliest stages of life, it's like Winnicott's, there's no such thing as a baby. There's always an infant and the caregiving, the mothering one. In a similar way, Harry Stack Sullivan talked about the most elemental periods of life where he talked about the prototaxic mode, which is another one of his idiosyncratic, for something very unitary and encompassing. And he also talked about what he called an empathic linkage. I'm blessed to be a great-grandfather. My great-granddaughter is now 1 year old as of September 13th.
Nice.
I watched my granddaughter be about as good a mother as I think a mother could be. Deeply engaged, but not intrusive, lively, energetic, utterly responsive to need. For Sullivan, needs such as hunger or exposure to cold or insecurities of one sort or another actually create what he called a tension within the body of the infant that's manifested by agitation, squirminess, or crying, which he called crying when hungry. The mother, I mean, literally, a nursing mother's milk comes down when she hears her baby cry. She needs to nurse. So the tension of tenderness is what is evoked in the mother through the empathic affective link with her infant that is a kind of urgency to provide what is needed. And Sullivan says that over time, this sequence of tension of need, evoking the response of the mother, generalizes in the experience of the infant to a general need for tenderness. The mother develops a generalized need to behave tenderly, to offer tenderness. I'm thinking, I know later on we're going to touch upon the ethical philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. But here I do want to say something he said in his theory. He says to recognize the other is to recognize a hunger. To recognize the other is to give. And I think that applies from a philosophical perspective to the developmental and the clinical. Just as there's a primary maternal preoccupation and an empathic linkage, I believe there's a primary analytic preoccupation. That if we are engaged like the empathic mother, and we experience the patient in a state of pain, need, agitation, whatever it is. I think there must be within us something drawn, something of a pressure, not a rescue fantasy, that we must feel tugged inside to offer what we can to that or that state. And that's what I call generous involvement.
Yeah. Well, and to continue with your idea with Sullivan as well, like you also talk about Lowell's primal density and Sullivan's oneness prior to differentiation. And I think that that's what you're talking about, is that when you talk about your granddaughter's mothering, that there's a deep oneness, if you will, tending and responding in some sort of call that the baby is bringing to her. And I think you're inviting us as analysts to respond to that call, if you will. And it's that I think that's what you're getting at with primal density, Lowell's idea of primal density and Sullivan's idea of oneness prior to differentiation.
Yeah. Well, Lowell, I think there's a certain structure to his theories and his various writings. He's very interested in the progressive and regressive aspects of
nice.
that if we don't have contact with the progressive, then we're not going to mature, we're not going to be enculturated, we're not going to have reflective functioning, we're not going to be adapted to civilization, we're not going to have strong ego functioning. But it can be desiccated, it can be deadened if it doesn't remain in close contact with the regressive elements, which is the passions, of our origins. And I think he thought of health as an easy commute back and forth, but we begin in some sense dependent upon our work. I don't think of the baby as incompetent and just fed. Right. I mean, clearly, there very early on is responsive dance of negotiations. But for the child's world, it is sustained by the way it's held in what I guess Lowell calls a primal density.
Yeah. It's
a little bit also like what Fairbairn says when he says libido is object seeking.
Yes.
We are born into a relational existence.
Yeah. That really challenges the blank screen idea, doesn't it? Yeah. I think that is so key to what I believe is change and transformation for our patients. It's the level of our involvement emotionally with their lives. And I think back often to when I first started out and I didn't know anything, but I really felt everything. And I think my first patients were, I'm going to stick with this guy because he's somehow in this with me. And I think generously involving myself and getting mixed up, believe me, but I think there's a real sense of my presence, which I think is what you're referring to in generous involvement. In this chapter, everybody wants to have your grandfather. What a wonderful man he must have been. You tell such a, and it's so fascinating to me too, how so many years ago, he formed your mind, your psychoanalytic mind. And you tell a very touching story of him when you were heading off to college. And from that, 3 primal modes of how you still practice today, containment, acceptance, and recognition, still are operative in your work. And I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners that story and what these 3 primal modes are that continue to operate in your mind as you work with patients.
Sure. I'll give a little backstory to it if I may be involved in that. I grew up in a family in which I was sponsored and loved, but not well recognized. As I was idealized, but not recognized. And in that sense, very lonely.
Yeah.
My grandfather was actually a step-grandfather, had no children of his own, married my grandmother the year after my parents were married. He was a Russian immigrant, dropped out of the 6th grade to support his mother and sister when his father abandoned them. He was a doughboy in the trenches in World War I. He was mustard gassed twice, spent months regenerating skin in the field hospital. And because of war injuries, he was given a license to run a newsstand in New York City. So my grandfather, Nat, if you walk past a street corner in New York City, I'm not sure, I haven't been to New York in several years, so I assume it's still there. He was one of those anonymous faces in the street that you pass and don't know, but you may buy a New York Times from, or a Police Gazette. The story that I want to tell, and it emerges from a childhood in which he knew how to play. Our family would get together for gatherings like Thanksgiving. He would come home from the newsstand. It was full of soot, newsprint, having worked since 5 a.m, and he'd be thinking Mademoiselle from Armentier's Parlez-Vous or Pennies from Heaven, while everyone else was sitting around the living room glowering at each other. So the story you asked about, I was 17. I was about to go off to Harvard. My parents had saved some money to take a trip to Europe. I lived with my grandparents in Midtown Manhattan for 3 or 4 weeks. I was not athletic. I was not tall. I was kind of a nerdy kid. I owned one jacket. My father bought it in one of those lower Manhattan stores where they hack off the label. It's like a step above the push cart. It was imitation madras. It wasn't even real. It was gray, yellow, white, and pink plaid with a shawl collar. So on this little kid, it looked like a bathrobe. That's what I had. Working with my grandfather at the newsstand as part of how I spent the time those weeks, one of the perks was I could take magazines home, and if I was careful with them, I could read them, and then we could sell them. So, of course, it was Playboy magazine. My grandfather must have walked past me, the fold-out couch I was on, and noticed I was not looking at the naked fold-out at that time. In August, Playboy at that time had a feature called the Fall Fashion Forecast for Men on Campus. I was looking at tweeds. Following morning, my grandfather's off at 5 or 5:30 to go to the newsstand. But my grandmother said to me, "Last night your grandfather came to me and he said, Stuart is afraid that he's going to go off to Harvard and not have the right clothing to wear and be ashamed of himself. And he said, I won't let that happen to him." So he instructed my grandmother, take me cross town to Fifth Avenue. We went to a store called Rogers Pete, where she bought me a 3-piece suit, a tweed jacket, a couple pair of pants, some shirts, ties, and a pair of shoes. This man who's, made a penny a paper. So aside from, it was wonderful to have all that clothing and, what a gift. Trauma is described in one way as, you can never be the same person after that.
Mm-hmm.
Something that is a rupture of who you've been, and you have to move on in life in some way changed.
Yeah.
This was a positive trauma.
Mm-hmm.
It was a shock, because the shock was someone sees what's going on inside of me, even beyond my own capacity to articulate it to myself.
Right.
I could come to know that affect state because he gave it form, because he saw it. He wasn't just compassionate, poor kid. He wasn't a passive bystander, He said, I won't let that happen to him.
Right.
That spirit is what I think analysts should bring into the consulting room.
Yes, I agree.
I do not mean rescue fantasy.
Right.
I do not mean, I will grandiosely assume that I can make your life all better. It may be that what we give is a receptive silence.
Yeah.
So that someone can bring themselves into focus and articulation. But there must be a felt visceral urge within to give of ourselves to what's needed at the moment, based on recognizing it.
Yeah. How I would take that, it's not a rescue, but a recognition.
Yes.
And you also talk about him and the nectarine story.
Yes.
That for this containment, acceptance, and recognition. Tell us about that, and then about each of these modes.
I was, by that time, a graduate student in clinical psychology. And my grandmother and grandfather and aunt and uncle were spending some time around New Year's in the Florida Keys. They invited me to come spend a few days with them. So I arrived late at night to Miami, was picked up, we drove to the Keys. I was tired. Early the next morning, my grandmother came to me. I was shaking myself awake and said, "Get your grandfather out of here." My aunt had always denigrated him. In some ways, she loved him. In some ways, she benefited from his kindness, but she never thought he was like good enough for her mother, not cultivated or educated enough. He read the Police Gazette, rather than Hemingway.
Yeah, right.
As a matter of fact, once I was reading a paperback of Cyrano de Bergerac, and it had a swashbuckling image on the cover. So he picked it up, and he must have opened it and read, "Roxanne, your name is like a bell that swings and rings," And he kind of flung it down on the coffee table and said, "The kid goes for this shit, don't he?" So here we were in the Florida Keys. My grandmother saying, "Get your grandfather out of here. Your aunt is not leaving him alone. Take the rented car." So I, washed my face, had a little breakfast, and drove north with him to the Everglades. And what I was feeling inside was, I'm tired. I came here for a vacation. I didn't come here to have to do this work. This family has such neurotic stuff. And once again, I'm kind of coerced into fixing it or doing something about it. So I was angry. I don't even think I was feeling very kindly to my grandfather. I was thinking, I got to babysit my grandfather, who had been so kind to me. I didn't want to openly, complain. So I was just very quiet, trying to settle myself, but feeling sorry for myself. We reached off the Keys, we reached the turnoff to the Everglades, and there was a farm stand right there. And my grandfather said, pull over. So I pulled over into their parking area. He got out, went inside, came out with a brown paper bag, got in the car, reached it over to me so I could see that inside were nectarines. And he said, want one? Now, what happened inside of me, my grandfather had just told me, I'm still your grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you don't like this one bit, but I still have something to give you. And that's where I describe it as also a challenge. In that sense, it was an interpretation of my state.
Yep.
It was a reaching out relationally with something that punctuated and gave shape to and allowed me to see what was happening in the force field between us.
Mm-hmm.
As Lou Aaron would say, it helped to shift the state of the field.
Mm-hmm.
And it challenged me to reach within myself and, stop feeling sorry for myself and join with my grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
which I did. We had a wonderful time in the Everglades. It was the last time I saw him. He died 3 months later.
Oh, wow. You didn't include that in the essay. That's powerful.
No,
Yeah.
no. I didn't think the reader needed that piece, but I said it.
I think it's very nice. Thank you. Yeah, and so there was this idea that you said he was still your grandfather. He owned some particular position in your story, like we as analysts do with our patients. And sort of a welcoming, not a chastising you of your bad mood, but a welcoming of your own multiplicity of states and feelings, and recognizing the position you'd been placed in, which that's what I hear in your word containment.
It reminds me that the first paper I wrote in 1990, where I begin to talk about negotiation, and that at the heart of an analytic process, I think, is a negotiation, like a Winnicottian squiggle game, but without paper and pencil.
Yeah.
And in that sense, an interpretation, in a way, an interpretation is the analyst saying, you can't make this of me, but you can make that of me. And the patient may say the same thing to the analyst. No, you can't make that of me. That doesn't feel true to me, but you can make that of me. I mean, it's an approximation in a certain way. And my grandfather, as you were saying, Roy, was saying, instead of making of me a burden, a problem,
Right.
make of me a grandfather where there's love between us and we can have a good time.
Yeah.
I like to think of an interpretation as handing a patient a nectarine.
Yeah. And then I think, to use your idea of negotiation, is, and then how is that received, right? And how is that negotiated? And how is that processed? But as your grandfather thought, I need to do something here. There's something that has to come out of me towards my grandson. And he offered you this nectarine, just like we offer. Here's the fruit of my thoughts, if you will. And now, what do you think of that? And what are we going to do with it? And I think the thing that you say in the book, under recognition, the fundamental quality therapeutic recognition is that the analyst is registering an imprint of the patient's state, even while striving to preserve their own integrity. So he's still your grandfather, and he's still registering you, and then trying to figure out what the hell are we going to do with this.
Yeah.
Very, very
And
nice.
since I didn't speak to what you asked before about containment and acceptance, sort of like the Bionian container contained, what I think of as containment is that a patient can bring raw states of affect, of confusion, of pain, of whatever, recurrently into an abiding relationship that holds it, and over time makes it safer to feel it, safer to settle into bringing it into focus. And by acceptance and its relationship to generous involvement, I think that, like my grandfather, in a non-judgmental way, we welcome the patient. We welcome the state that they bring to us.
Yeah.
We accept what they feel and what we feel when we're with them. It even includes bearing their despair, at times feeling confused, even bored, but not disconnected bored, but what's happening now? Why does it feel so deadened? Is there anything I can bring here? Do I wait? Do I say something? I mean, it's a very active relationship, but an acceptance. I think one of the things I think about acceptance is that sometimes we say things to patients that we can anticipate will lead to tension between us.
Yeah.
Will not be welcomed so readily. It, in some sense, can become harder work and inconvenient to ourselves. But in the service of therapeutic movement, in the service of offering something to the patient, in the service of our negotiation with the patient, we, like Don Quixote heading for the windmill, we move sometimes toward where the discomfort will be for us.
Absolutely.
Rather than say, I'd rather spare myself this stuff.
Yeah.
That's generous involvement.
I would say we as analysts, we can often confuse containing and acceptance, which is really a defense against actually entering into those very primitive places that nobody seems to want to go. And I think that's what you're saying here, is that part of being tender is also being letting loose, if you will, with the emotional states that are actually present but not being spoken about.
Right, you're saying that leads me to want to say that this urge to offer something.
Yeah.
What I'm not talking about is swooping in to fix the state in order to defensively divert the feeling, which is a message of, I can't stand your feeling, I want us to get away from it.
Yeah.
Sometimes what we give is, I am with you, like in the 23rd Psalm,
Yeah.
patient can walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
Yeah.
We're not godlike.
Right.
But we can still say, I am with you.
Yeah.
And I'm with you in the feeling is a giving of something, as opposed to, here, let's look elsewhere and both of us will feel better.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a natural segue into your work on kindness, what it is and what it is not. And you talk about kindness is, it's kind to be able to bear conflict in oneself and others. It is kind to oneself and others, to forego magic and sentimentality. It is kind to see individuals as they are, rather than how we might want them to be. It is kind to care for people just as we find them. But then you go on and you speak of what kindness is not, and you offer 15 bullet points. So when I saw those bullet points, I thought, boy, he has some thoughts about this. He wants to make sure we get them. Why don't you talk about that for us in our chat here? Elaborate on what kindness is not.
I'd like to. First of all, what you just read was me quoting Adam Phillips there.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good.
I don't want to take credit for his writing.
Good for you. Yeah.
But yeah, I thought that what I was writing could be misconstrued.
Yes, I agree.
And lead, in some sense, the reader astray, because there are lookalikes to analytical generosity that I think are subverting of the analytic process.
I agree.
Well, one thing I say, I don't know that I'll think of all 15 without looking at it, but I say to begin with that analytic generous involvement is not compassion, which I think of as feeling with. And what I'm trying to emphasize there is you're not a passive bystander.
Right.
You are reaching inside and moving forth from within to offer something. And yet, at the same time, it's not what Freud called the furor sonandi, which was his criticism of Ferenczi, whose active technique he felt was like a rescue fantasy. And there's a lot of masochism in Ferenczi that I would not be commending to the reader. And as a matter of fact, one of the 15 points is that it's not needless suffering or masochistic surrender.
Right.
Similarly, it's not a narcissistic masochism, a kind of only I can take all this.
Right.
That self-satisfaction of I can bear the pain because I'm special. It's not the presumption that my love is healing. It's not, certainly not giving tweeds. It's not a largesse, kind of charity. It's because it's not noblesse oblige, it's not condescending in that way. It doesn't seek to take away the agency of the patient.
Yeah.
It doesn't seek to create what's called a bastion of safe avoidance of the difficult stuff. It's not a reaction formation. It's not a pathological accommodation or a mutually idealizing way of both of you indulging each other and feeling we both very special. It's not an avoidance of aggression or reparation for aggression. And one of the important things, Christopher Bolus has a wonderful concept he calls extractive introjection, where, and you can hear it in a lot of contexts. A person says something, and the other person says it again, presumably better. And he's talking, Bolus talks about mothers and who appropriate from the child's mind, the child's creativity, and make it theirs. And I think he's implicitly saying analysts. And maybe that's what Winnicott's saying when he says in his use of the object paper, he's learned to not indulge his cleverness, but to wait for the creativity, of the patient.
Yeah.
So it's not, I'm the only creative person in the room. I'm the only good person in the room. All good things come from me. I don't want to disempower
Hmm.
Nor do I want to be on a pedestal so good that the only position left for the patient is to be the only bad person in the room.
Right, right. And to agree with you, the good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's at least the gist of what I'm trying to alert people to, that I don't mean that those things are generous involvement.
Right, right. Nice. In the book, you talk about the case of Nathan, and I wondered if you wanted to use that case to talk about how you practice, or if there's another one that comes to your mind. Um, yeah. Any thoughts about that?
Well, if it's okay, I'll tell that story.
Okay.
Nathan was very distinguished in his field, in academia and research. I mean, he was world class in terms of prizes, and being a plenary speaker, being keynote speaker constantly. He might have been on the list for the Nobel Prize, which he never won. And what kept him from full realization was a lot of compulsive activity that consumed too much of his time, attention, and energy and distracted him. He had a serious lipid disorder. And although he was very disciplined in doing vigorous exercise, he would spend, part of his morning checking out around the Cambridge area what fast food store was having a discount or a bargain. And he'd have lunch there and save his 25 cents or whatever and feel triumphant. He would go shopping in bargain basements and he'd actually switch the price tags to bring a lower price to the cash register. When he flew to these conferences, when he was a keynote speaker, he stole the headsets that they used to give out in those days. And he had affairs. His wife learned of one of his affairs, did not know of the extent of it. But learning of that affair, she did not know if she could remain married to him. So they came into couples therapy with me, which lasted maybe 6 sessions. And what she arrived at is they had a marriage of, by that time, about 35 years or so. She would consider investing in a continued marriage and seeking to heal from the injury if he'd enter an individual therapy. And she asked if it would be with me. Somehow she felt some connection or hope. He was, shotgun patient then with me. And being a very important person and also a very arrogant person, I describe him, I know in that chapter, as looking like Robert De Niro in a perpetual state of annoyance. He really had a don't mess with me look. And so in any case, I undertook the treatment and listened to him. And in some sense, he wouldn't let me speak very much. He unloaded on me. And in some sense, it was an avoidance of engaging with me. And I was able at one point to say to him, trying as gently as I could, you seem to need to upload into me a lot of information about you before I can think with you about your life. When he told me that he loved to drive to New York City because he could stop off at the highway McDonald's and eat whatever shit he wanted, and he said, and no one sees me. I said to him, including yourself.
Yeah.
That was the first risky venture I took. And he gave me a look like,
Yeah.
all right, I won't shoot you this time.
Right. Yeah.
So we went on in this mode for about a couple months or so.
Huh.
The end of it, there's a particular session which was full of stuff. He tells more about his early history and about how his mother was enmeshing, engulfing, needy, but would have shrieking fits and was very challenging for him. And that he would turn to his father, and his father sat in the corner, read the paper, and sort of abandoned him to deal with your mother yourself. In the anger and entitlement that came out of, what Barsness would call destructive entitlement that came out of what he suffered, he said he became a ruffian. He killed squirrels. He threw a rock in the back of a girl's head. He, fancied himself a tough guy. He's 9 years old. He's with the guys on the street corner. And he says, hey, let's set off the fire alarm. And none of the other kids would do this. So he pulled the fire alarm. All the other boys ran. He stood there. Sure enough, a hook and ladder drives up. And a fireman steps down from the engine, full regalia, looming over him. And what Nathan described to me was that he thought that for sure he was going to be sent home to his mother, and it would be awful. What the fireman did was to look him slowly in the face and say, you shouldn't be doing things like this. He got back in the fire engine, drove off.
Mm-hmm.
And Nathan told one more story. He had some childhood condition. He never said what it was, but he was in the children's unit of a hospital. He claims that there was very limited parental visiting.
Mm.
And he also said that he was very neglected by staff. And one of the examples he gave was that there was evidently a light socket without a bulb in it, and that it was over his bed.
Yeah.
So he described how he burned his finger, and it's an example, no one was watching. He's getting ready to leave the office, gathering his stuff, sitting in the chair, looks up and says, oh, by the way, I won't be here next week. I'm going to a conference, and I plan to have an affair with someone I've been with before. So at that moment, and I use this to talk about generous involvement in the sense of I'm all in with this struggle with him.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about Levinas, but I will invoke a Levinasian idea. I even felt responsible for his responsibilities. I was thinking, what are you going to do to your wife? But I was also thinking, what are you going to do to your marriage? If your marriage ends, I don't know if you'll survive this. You're more dependent on her than you realize. Or you'll live in bad faith, you'll continue to lie and subvert everything. I was furious with him because I knew he was kind of saying, okay, Bus, what are you going to do now? Kind of thing. It was a challenge. So I was both worried, angry, but felt like I had to give him a nectarine before he left the room. But what would it be? Am I going to say, don't do it? He could barely let me say, don't eat a hamburger. And so I couldn't really be his conscience. And I knew if I just was silent and figured, well, we'll see what happens and we'll talk about it, I would be like the hospital staff and he'd get burned. So somehow what came out of me, I said, I wish we had that fireman in here right now.
Oh, nice.
And he was perplexed, and he said, why?
Yeah.
Said, because I wonder what it would be like for you to spend some time with them now.
Mhm.
And what it felt like I was saying is, we need a conscience in
Yeah.
here. I know I can't be it, but
Yeah.
maybe by naming that I can't be it, I
Mm.
can invoke something that you've brought to me that must mean something to you.
Yeah.
And he came back from the conference. He did not have the affair.
I like it. Stuart, time has just flown, and it's been a joy to be with you. And I can see how generously you are involved in your work and in your own personal life, and in the stories of your patient, and how you have probably seen great success in your work because of your very own spirit, and the way that you participate and how you are present here in our conversation even today. So thank you so much. And I'm wondering if you have any last words for our listeners.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your generous kindness
Mm,
and your hospitality to me.
mm-hmm.
I ended that paper with a quote from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll end with that.
Okay, that sounds good.
From Measure for Measure. And he says, thyself and thy belongings are not thine own so proper as to waste thyself upon thy virtues, they on thee. Heaven doth with us as we with torches do, not light them for themselves. For if our virtues did not go forth of us, 'twere all alike as if we had them not.
Mm.
So much for the blank screen.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you. And unfortunately, we have to pull the curtain. But thank you so much for your time and for contributing to the book and to the series and to the audience that will benefit from your lifelong work. Deeply, deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.